Hi everyone and welcome. This is the 9th Google Hangout session of the Pixel Project's 5th annual International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning and best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women, to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. And to help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign. I'll be telling you a bit more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser a bit later. We have so much exclusive author goodies that you can get your hands on. Meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project, you can go to www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so for this session, we have a really special guest. We have a live discussion and Q&A with the fabulous Jen Williams. Jen is a fantasy author from London. Her Copper Cat and Winnowing Fame trilogies have picked up 4 British Fantasy Award nominations between them, and in 2018, the 9th Reign won the Best Fantasy Novel Award. She's also partly responsible for the creation of the Super Relaxed Fantasy Club and is partial to mead if you are buying. Jen has also very generously donated some fantastic treats to the stash of author goodies that we have set up as perks for donors at our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So let me tell you what they are. There are 2 bundles. So treat number 1 is the Jen Williams Dragon Arts Goodie Bundle. And this contains 1 first edition paperback signed and personalized copy of The Ninth Reign and 1 signed and personalized first US edition paperback of The Copper Promise. And these 2 books contain much prized dragon drawings and doodles from Jen, and also some postcards in the bundle. And this goodie has actually been snapped up by a really awesome donor. Her name is Elizabeth Semku, and we just want to say thanks, Elizabeth, for donating and getting Jen Williams' goodie bundle. But there is still 1 more left. So the one that's left, treat number 2, is a chance to become a minor character in Jen's next book, and this is available for donors worldwide. So you will feature in Jen's next book, and when it is published, she will send you a copy wherever you are in the world. So you please go ahead and get it as soon as possible. There's only 1 left, and this Tuckerization, the chance to be a minor character, is something very rarely offered by Jen and really any author anywhere. So once someone snaps it up, it's gone forever. And all funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to end violence against women. And now we are currently at $1,985 towards our $2,500 goal. So we're almost there. You can help us out. Please do give generously. I will be telling you how you can actually get your hands on the goodie bundle that Jen has donated a little later in the session, and how you can help the cause. So stay tuned for that. But meanwhile, Jen is going to do a live reading, as I said, and then there will be a live discussion. We will have a Q&A session, which you guys can participate in. All you have to do is type in your questions in the chat box that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a great moderator today. Her name is Michelle. Michelle is going to gather your questions, give them to me, and I will read them out to Jen, and Jen will answer them. Yes, and okay, so now it's time for the reading. I do have to issue a little warning, though. We have a bit of strong language coming up. So if you want to skip this, go and get a cup of coffee and tea and come back in 10 minutes, or if you can stay, up to you. So here we are. Here's Jen. Hi, Jen.
Hi. Hello.
Hi. So now I believe you're going to be reading from the Poison Song.
I am, yeah. I thought I would read the very beginning section of that. I should just wave the book slowly past the screen.
There it
is. Yeah, so I thought I would read the very beginning bit. It's difficult to read from any bit of a trilogy, really, without spoilers. So I've decided to not worry about it. So I'm going to read the very opening section. So it's not hugely spoilery because this is the beginning of the book, but it's you know, it's got some action. It's hopefully quite exciting, and it introduces you to the world. So I'll do it like in terms of a quick setup. In this world that the books are set, Some girls are born with the ability to drain the energy of other people and then release it in fire, in the form of fire. So a kind of pyromaniac kind of ability. And in this world, a religious order has grown up around that seek to keep these women kind of imprisoned and away from other people, so they can't harm anyone, and they're kind of seen as abominations and evil and stuff. So this scene that I'm going to read kind of takes place around this place, which is called the Winery. This is kind of the prison, the giant prison for these women with magical abilities. So I'll read the beginning bit. It's about 10 minutes long, so not hugely long. Yeah, I'll just have a quick sip of water. My giant pint mug, sorry about that. I could have put a more elegant glass, couldn't I? But no.
It's fine.
It's huge. Okay. Put that flame away, unless you want to go back to your cell. The girl looked up at her, startled, and Agent Chenlo smiled to lessen the harshness of her words. These girls, she reminded herself, were not yet used to the license they'd been given, limited as it was, and even less used to the idea that a misstep wouldn't automatically earn them a freezing bath or a beating. The tiny lick of green flame that had been curling in the girl's palm immediately vanished. Put your gloves back on, fell Lisbeth, and here, look. Agent Chenlo gently turned the girls to look back at the Winery. The small jetty they stood on was chilly and damp, and the little boat docked there smelled overpoweringly of shellfish, but the Winery remained its black, imposing self, looming over the fell witches like a threat. You see those windows there that go all the way up the turret tower, and those in Mother Crescen's territory? A sister or a father may look out of those windows at any time, or even the drowned one herself. She ignored the mutter at her use of this forbidden phrase. And they could see us huddled down here on this grey day, and winnow fire, even the tiniest flicker, will draw their gaze like that. She snapped her fingers for emphasis. She did not wear gloves herself today. It is so bright, it's like a beacon to them. And do you think that if you are caught using your abilities without permission, they will allow you to become agents yourselves? The girls shuffled and muttered as one, picking at their scarves and casting shy glances at the towers. They liked Agent Chenlo because she gave warnings before punishments, and because she called the winnow fire an ability and not an abomination, at least when she was out of earshot of the other agents. Come on, let's get those barrels on board, or we'll be late. Quickly now. The girls returned to the task at hand. Today was the beginning of their introduction to the business of the Winery, the daily and weekly tasks that kept the order going. They would load barrels of Acaris up onto the little boat and make the quick crossing to Mashenska, where they would be unloaded again. They would then accompany Agent Chenlo to the trading house, where much of the Acaris would be sold in bulk to the highest bidders. A unique drug that could only be crafted within the intense heat of winnow fire, Acaris gave its user a deep, dreamless sleep, unless it was cut with a variety of stimulants, in which case the effects were rather more lively. Officially, only the Winery could supply the drug, and thanks to this little monopoly, they could happily charge through the nose for it. Once the Acaris had been changed into useful coin, Agent Chenlo and the novice agents would return across the channel of grey water, and that would be that. Small steps, but important ones, learning how to conduct themselves out in the world, showing that they could be trusted. If any one of the four girls stepped out of line, it would be up to Agent Chenlo to admonish them, which could mean anything from a severe dressing down to having their life energy removed to the point where they passed out. She was authorized to kill them if she had to, and she carried the silver-topped cudgel normally worn by the sisters at her belt, but Agent Chenlo had never had to use it. She watched them for a moment, rolling the barrels up the gangplank, observed by a wiry captain and a spotty cabin boy. The barrels were heavy, and sometimes the fell witches found the work too difficult, weakened as they were by years spent in damp cells eating gruel. But this group were making the best of it. Satisfied that they'd be able to manage, Agent Chenlo turned away to look across the sea to Mashenska. and all of the familiar ordinariness of the day was chased away by the sight of an impossible shape in the skies over the city, a nightmare coming into focus. She made an odd noise, somewhere between a yelp and a gasp, and heard the captain shout something. One of the girls let out a little shriek. A dragon was flying over the sea towards them. It was a magnificent thing, covered in pearly white scales, its wings bristling with white feathers. It wore a harness of brown leather and silver, and there was a young woman sitting on its back, her black hair flapping wildly in the wind, and a furious expression on her face. Agent Chenlo turned back and shouted at the girls. Go! Get on the boat, now! You! She gestured at the captain. Get them to the city. Cast off immediately. The man opened his mouth to argue, and she raised her hands in a clear threat. Do it, Captain, or I will sink your miserable boat myself. The novice agents were all either staring at the dragon, it was so close now, so close, or staring at her, their eyes wide. Agent Chenlo clapped her hands together once, sharply, and the spell broke. As one, the young women ran up the gangplank, and as they disappeared below decks, she felt a surge of relief. From the towers, bells were ringing as various people sounded the alarm all at once. Chenlo hesitated on the jetty, uncertain what to do next. Knowledge of a number of recent events jostled for her attention, but one thing was clearer than anything else. As unlikely as it seemed, the dragon had to be a legendary war beast from distant Ibora, and the young woman riding its back had every reason to be furious with the Winnery. She began to run towards the main buildings. The dragon got there first, crashing into and through one of the high, spindly towers. Black chunks of rock exploded into the sky as the very top of the structure was smashed to pieces, and then, with a roar, the dragon turned, coming around for another attack. This time the monster landed on the tower that housed the sisters' quarters, latching onto it with tails and claw. It brought its nearest talon up to a long window, sealed with glass and lead, and smashed it quite neatly. Agent Chenlo saw the woman on its back shouting something, and then after a moment she leaned forward and sent a barrage of winnow fire in through the newly gaping hole. Chenlo, still staggering towards the gates, felt her skin turn cold, as though she had been doused by a great wave of seawater. It was late in the morning and most of the sisters would be at their duties, yet she doubted very much that the tower was empty. Activity erupted at the Chirot Tower. A trio of agents mounted on bats flew out through its open roof, rounding quickly on the dragon, which was just lifting off from the sisters' tower. Down on the ground, the doors leading to Thomas's walk sprung open to reveal several panicked-looking sisters, their faces smeared with soot. Behind them, it was clear that the interior of the tower was ablaze, and one of them, a woman Chenlo knew as Sister Resin, ran up to her, the silver mask of her order still clutched in one hand. You! Get up there and stop them! Chenlo spared her a glance, then looked up to where the other agents were engaging the dragon. Bright orbs of green fire danced across the sky and were met with jets of violet flame. Have you lost your mind? That's a dragon. They're going to get themselves killed. Sister Resin's face turned red under the soot, and her wet mouth creased with outrage. You dare to speak to me this way, Agent Chenlo? Chenlo shook her head in annoyance, unable to look away from the scene playing out around the towers. The bats were circling, brought into line by their agent riders, but it was clear that they were terrified of the giant flying lizard. The dragon stopped breathing fire for a moment and surged forward, bringing its long tail around in a whip-crack movement that connected with the nearest bat, striking it from the sky. It fell out of sight, its rider struggling with the harness. The woman was still shouting, and one of the remaining two agents turned her back and fled, heading directly out to sea. More sisters and fathers streamed out of the furnace rooms, several of them half-dressed, while the dragon circled higher. One of the fathers was Father Iranus, every inch of smugness wiped from his jowly face. It's her, isn't it? He spat. He wasn't wearing any shoes, and his bare feet looked like ugly sea creatures against the sand. That fucking lunatic has come home. Come home with a dragon, said Chenlo faintly. The last agent had been chased from the sky. What did you think would happen? Taking advantage of their distraction, she turned the full contempt of her gaze on the fathers and sisters gathered behind her. Sending Tyranny O'Keefe, of all people, to steal from Ibora, to steal the kin of Thomas Savus, actual fire-breathing dragons. As if Felnoon didn't have enough reason to hate the Winnery already. Iranus looked at her blankly, just as though he hadn't been present in the many discussions where Chenlo had argued, again and again, that their plan was outrageously risky. She opened her mouth, unable to resist giving them another piece of her mind, when the dragon dropped down towards them. The fathers and sisters scattered, most running down across the sands, with the few heading back to the furnace. Chenlo stood her ground, wincing against the winds that battered her as the great white dragon landed in the courtyard. All those women, she thought, with a surge of terror, cooked alive in their cells. Wait! You must wait! Felnoon turned, and Chenlo was reminded of how young the rogue witch was, barely older than the novice agents she had been training. She was wearing strange Eboran clothes, and the bat-wing tattoo on her forehead, a twin to Chenlo's own, looked out of place as though someone had scrawled it over a painting of a mythical figure in a book. What must we wait for? Asked the dragon. Chenlo blinked. She knew, of course, that war beasts could speak, but actually hearing that fine, cultured voice, being regarded by those burning violet eyes, that was something else. Please. She held up her hands, too aware that such an action from a fell witch was almost always a threat. Please, Felnoon, the women in there have done you no harm. I know you must be angry. Angry? The young woman grinned wolfishly. You don't know the half of it, winnery dog. I urge you not to strike those who share your own miserable past. At this, Felnoon looked faintly puzzled. She shook her head. I'm not here for them, she said. Got to leave it there, I think.
Ooh, cliffhanger.
Everything's about to be blown up. Yay.
Thanks, Jen. Before I start with the questions, I just want to clarify something. I said earlier that our goal was 2,500. That's actually our halfway goal. So our total goal is $5,000. So guys, we're almost at our halfway point. So please do donate so we can reach it. Okay, so I have a whole bunch of questions. I will start with one about female characters, since we saw a lot of women just now that you just read. And your books generally they do feature a lot of and plenty of fantastic female characters who are complex and they have agency, they are tough, they're resilient, they go through amazing journeys of self-discovery, they're independent, they're also human and they're flawed. So the first question is, who or what are your inspirations for your female characters?
Oh, well, gosh, thank you, by the way. Yeah, I think it's always tricky to kind of narrow it down to things like inspirations when you're writing characters, because they tend to be formed of this kind of weird alchemy that happens in your subconscious, I think. So it's probably lots of different things. I know that when I was writing the Copper Cat trilogy, when I first wrote The Copper Promise, I wanted to very specifically write a female character who was the central character, who wasn't kind of any sort of accessory to a male character. I think I was quite frustrated at the time with a lot of fantasy that I had read where women kind of only turned up because they were necessary to the male character's journey. So they would be the main character's mum or his girlfriend who gets murdered, or there would be like a princess that he would win at the end. And this is kind of making it sound really simplistic, and I know a lot of fantasy books aren't, but it comes down to those kind of archetypal roles. And it was quite frustrating for me because I wanted to see female characters who had really cool roles, who did the cool stuff. You know, I wanted to read about a woman who was like Indiana Jones or Han Solo, you know, or other Harrison Ford characters. Characters who were the main character and got to say the cool lines and do the cool stuff, you know. So that's where Widgerin came from, definitely in the Coppercat books, because I just wanted this really cool female character who wasn't anyone's love interest. She was kind of her own person. And I suppose if she has kind of direct influences, weirdly, one of the direct influences on Widgerin would be Nanny Ogg from the Discworld novels.
Really?
I know. Wouldn't necessarily make that connection because, you know, is a grandmother for a start. and is kind of a tiny old lady who makes lots of rude jokes. But I really love Terry Pratchett's books, and I love the way that he writes the witches in those books, because I think it was the first time reading fantasy books where I felt like I recognized the women in them, because they were like women that I knew, in that they were clever and powerful and quite scary, and quite funny. And I think a lot of Nanny Ogg's attitude, and possibly her drinking habits, came through in Witcherin. So, yeah. Also, a slightly probably more obvious influence on the Coppercat books and Widgerin and Sebastian in particular is Fritz Lieber's Fafford and the Grey Mouser sword and sorcery stories, which feature these two mercenaries who, one of them's a rogue, the other one's a warrior. They get into all sorts of scrapes. So the Coppercat was kind of, I suppose, a modern update of that in a way.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. You just talked about you not wanting to write archetypal roles, or being sort of sick of them. So I have a question about stereotypes and tropes. All genres have these stereotypes and tropes, but you seem to be breaking them, like the Coppercat, for example. I remember there was this a sort of a description of her or someone was observing her, and she could have been a tall, curvy, beautiful woman with luscious red locks and full lips, like hair flying and that kind of thing. And she's in fact a short, skinny woman with untidy short hair, and she's not what you expect. Why do you decide to deliberately break stereotypes? Or actually, a better question would be, how do you break stereotypes and then still create a character with agency, who has to deal with the world around her, including situations that involve sexism and misogyny and violence against women and girls?
Yeah, I enjoyed that. That bit is very early on in the Copper Promise, I think, where essentially one of the characters has heard about them, and he's expecting to meet, the Coppercat of Crosshaven, and he's imagining this kind of Red Sonja figure who probably wearing chainmail bikini and is be beautiful. But what he meets is Widgerin, who's kind of like an average normal sort of person who wears a lot of boiled leather and swears a lot, and it's just kind of normal, and he's completely wrong-footed by it. And it was really fun to play with that kind of fantasy expectation of what people think the female character is going to be like in a fantasy book. It is one of those things that annoys me, is that female characters in fantasy books are often defined by how beautiful they are. She's always described in terms of beauty, and I think I've deliberately avoided that through all of my books. The female characters are never described as beautiful. I mean, they're described in a way that might suggest that they're not a bag of spanners in the face department, but it's not all about that. It's not about how beautiful they are. And on the other hand, I've also tried to more often describe the male characters as beautiful, because it's like other thing. But the male gaze in fantasy books is something else that I find quite exhausting. So I'm trying to actively combat that by kind of turning it on its head a bit. But yeah, as you say, particularly in the Coppercat books, I was looking to break down stereotypes and archetypes in fantasy. So my warrior character, for example, who's called Sebastian, is gay. And I wanted to be able to, again, it's just one of those things where you just don't see that character very often in fantasy. And I wanted to tell you a story about a character, and it's not all about him being gay. That's just who he is. And that was another sort of part of writing that I was very passionate about, was this idea that the identities that you don't see very often in fantasy should be just treated as normal and expected. So in the Winnowing Flame trilogy, Vintage, who's the main character, is gay, and there's another character in it called Aldacer, who's gay, and they it's not a huge question. You're not really debating at any point. They're just there because they exist, because they people exist in real life everywhere, and it's just a better, more realistic picture of what life is like, you know. I think, interestingly, talking about, you know, in terms of combating sexism specifically in the books themselves, there are a few times when I was in the writing process where it was a question I asked myself, because often in fantasy books, the world is, you know, the world that they're in is misogynist or patriarchal. And there were a few times where I had to ask myself, is this that sort of world? And most of the time I decided not to make it that way, you know. In the Coppercat books, it's never really questioned whether Widrin is capable or not. She just is. She just gets on with it. So I tried to combat it in slightly more subversive ways. So Widrin is the most capable one. She's the leader. She's the one that makes the plans, even if they don't always work. And that's kind of, it was more of a subversive thing. Whereas in the Winnowing Flame trilogy, which obviously big thread of those books is about the suppression of women, the oppression of women rather, and that was me meeting it a bit more head on, I suppose.
Okay, I'll come back to that point later, but since you were talking about characters just now, about, you know, powerful female characters, you also have some pretty rare female characters rare for the fantasy genre, rare because they are villains or they are middle-aged or they're mothers. Was it a conscious decision to create protagonists like this, or did they just appear because they fit the story? And why do you think the fantasy genre lacks these kinds of characters?
Yeah, I suppose they were conscious decisions, because I was, I think in the Coppercat books, in the third book, Widrin's mother turns up, and she's her name's Davinia the Red, and she is a kind of a really famous pirate, and basically makes Widrin's life a nightmare, because that's what mothers do.
Yeah.
Just in case my mum's watching, I don't mean my mum, obviously, who is a dad.
Of course not.
And yeah, it just occurred to me at the time that you don't often see anyone's mum in fantasy books. You know, they're usually already dead, or they just don't make an appearance. And I thought that was kind of sad, because writing the interactions between, you know, like a grown child and their mum or a parent is always hilarious. You know, you can get so much great character stuff out of how people deal with their parents. It's a real shame that you don't see it more often. And kind of when I finished the Silver Tide and I was thinking about writing the Ninth Reign, it occurred to me that it would be really cool to have an older, middle-aged female character as the lead, you know, because they don't really kind of turn up in fantasy books that much, and certainly not as the lead. And vintage, interestingly, I was in the very, very early stages of planning the Ninth Reign. I knew I wanted one of the characters to be a scholar, to be somebody who was really interested in the history and of the world and their enemies and stuff. And my initial thought was to have kind of a young male character who doesn't really know what he's doing, but is quite nerdy and really into books. And I just couldn't get on with it at all. I just was really irritated by the character and wanted them to die. And I just thought, well, what if I completely flipped that and had, you know, this older middle-aged woman fulfill that role? And as soon as I kind of had that idea, Vintage became completely real. You know, she became her own character, and it was like, oh, this is what this is what the story needs. It's her, because she's 1,000 times more interesting than this young nerdy bloke that no one cares about.
Yeah. And you see, actually, I was just thinking, you see a lot of middle-aged men, right? Because obviously they would be the really experienced people who are leaders and everything. Why don't you ever see the middle-aged women who are really experienced leaders and know what they're doing and, you know, experts in their field? So what's the difference? But yeah, it's really cool that we're starting to see these characters now. Do you ever feel any pressured by gender or cultural stereotypes to make your female characters likable or relatable? Or do you ever get any flack for not making a female character likable enough?
I don't think I've never had any flack that I've noticed. Possibly people saying about it in reviews that I don't read. But I don't know. Do I feel any pressure to make them likable? I think I want you to like everyone in my books. Like even the really horrible people, like for example the kind of the villain in the Winnowing Flame trilogy. Well, there are kind of two, and they're both one's kind of female, I suppose. She's the baddie is like a hive mind insectoid race, and they're represented by the queen. So she is kind of vaguely female, but the other main antagonist is a woman called Hestilian, who's the sister of one of the main characters, and she does some very bad things throughout all three books. And in fact, the opening prologue of the Ninth Reign features her murdering a child. So she's fairly terrible and does some awful things throughout the books. But I really like her. I think you kind of have to, when you're creating characters, you have to feel some empathy for them, and you have to understand their struggle. So it's difficult for me to completely hate anyone in my books. But what I do, I think the way that I approach it is I need to make them understandable on some level, and that requires making them as complex as possible so that they feel like real people. So then it's up to the reader whether they like them or not.
Okay.
And I have plenty of likable characters. You can have one that you don't like. It's all right.
Okay. So we have a few people watching, and we actually got a comment from James Latimer, who says, "Hi Jen, I can't stay very long, no Wi-Fi, but I just wanted to say that your books are awesome, and so are you for doing this." And he says, "Poison song!" exclamation mark and an emoji, which I don't know how to describe it. It's like when a person is really excited, he goes ah. So he's really excited about Poison song. Okay.
With emoji, it's fine.
Sorry, people speak in emojis nowadays. Okay, a question from Doug Strider. Hi, Jen. I would love to know who has been your most favorite character to write, and what would you talk about on a night in the pub with them? And also hashtag Mead rules.
Oh, that's great. My favorite character to write has been, gosh, it probably is. My favorite character has been Hestilian, I think, which I know everyone is kind of horrified by when I talk about that because she does terrible things. But there is something really interesting about her journey through the books because she essentially goes through this awful trauma. So in the books, her people, the Aborans, have essentially died out because of a disease, and she's spent the last few years of her life watching everyone she knows die. So it's really interesting to kind of trace where that trauma takes her, and the weird decisions she makes. As for going down the pub with her, I think that would probably be awful, and I'm not sure what would. I don't know if we'd end up like having a fight, or I feel like we'd definitely get into a punch up if I went to the pub with Hestilian. She would take offence at somebody, or someone would spill her drink, and then it would all kick off.
Yeah. Who would you like to go to a pub with?
I'd love to go to the pub with Widrin because it would be extremely messy and hilarious, I'm sure. So
yeah,
I mean,
it sounds like a fun party if she was there.
Yeah, she belongs in a tavern basically, and I'd be for that.
Okay, I have questions about male characters. So there are a few misogynistic characters, or not very nice people in your books, but other than that, the male and female relationships between the characters are quite equitable. Like you said just now, in the Copper Cat series, you tried to write a world that is not misogynistic, it's not patriarchal like the one we know, and the men are respectful of women, their thoughts and decisions. What do you want your readers, especially the younger readers, to take away from this?
Well, I think it's it's important to be able to show worlds like that, you know, and say this is entirely reasonable expectation to treat women as, you know, as people, because we are, you know, and that's
Women
all
are people.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's such a stupid thing to have to even talk about, but that is at the root of it, you know, that wanting respect and to be treated equally it should be an entirely normal expectation, because we have exactly the same, you know, value as men. So yeah, I suppose I would like people to read those books and see that that they're inclusive, that, you know, it's about everybody being able to belong in that world. I had an email from somebody once who read the Coppercat books, who really loved the character of Lord Thryth in the books. Essentially, he starts off as a terrible person, and gradually he has a redemption, and he becomes a much better person. But he's also a magic user. He gains magic throughout the course of the books, and he's kind of frail as well at the beginning. You know, he undergoes this terrible stuff happens to him, and he's very broken and hurt by what's happened to him, sort of both physically and emotionally, and he gradually heals over that. And somebody emailed me to say how much that meant to them to see a character like that in a fantasy book. In the, you know, it wasn't your typical macho giant duty McDude, you know, who, you know, carries his broadsword around and is generally really manly and doesn't show his feelings and is very stoic. But it's a very different character who had to come to terms with how he felt about things. Was physically not that kind of huge stereotype of, you know, enormous masculine man, but was still very powerful. You know, he was still able to do these incredible feats in the book, and to grow and to become a person. So I think that's important as well, to be able to show different types of what you would term masculinity, I suppose. You know, that too can be all different things as well as women can. You know, I think that's just as important.
Yeah, which actually brings me to my next question. You kind of halfway answered it, which is about breaking stereotypes of male characters. Like you said, this prince who, you know, he's mysterious, handsome prince. He's a bit of a jerk in the beginning. He's he's frail. You do have a large muscular warrior, but he's a scholar, and like you said, you made Sebastian. I mean, Sebastian is gay, but it's totally normal. You don't ever see that in fantasy books. Do you think? How do you think stories that describe men this way, like away from the hostile, toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and vulnerability and, you know, emotion, can be a way that science fiction fantasy authors can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and sometimes the dehumanization of women? Do you think that this will work?
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I really feel quite strongly about it. You know, I think this is incredibly important, because fiction is all about kind of promoting empathy. It's all about getting the reader to feel what the characters are feeling. It's all about that, you know, empathic link. And if you can do that and show people, you know, this is what it's like to be a woman, this is what it's like, you know, to experience other genders, or to, this is how it's possible. It's, you know, it's entirely possible for men to have this softer side, to be able to show their feelings. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, in fact, it's vital, and it will be better for everyone, you know, if that was the case. So I think it's like a really useful tool for us. You know, if you can, then I think it's almost a responsibility to do that, because we desperately need to be able to feel more empathy for people, for each other.
Do you think that okay, sorry, I kind of lost my question. Okay. Now, the line between consent and coercion is not very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. You know, do you think it's an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
Do you mean like kind of the sort of the rape issue in fantasy book.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, when things are couched as romantic or like that kind of thing, but actually there's not a lot of consent going on, and yeah, and in fantasy there is a lot of rapey stuff going on. So yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I hope that we're moving away from some of that. I think there is fantasy rightly has a bit of a reputation for not being particularly big on consent in books. And there's an awful lot of time, a number of times when it's used, when rape is used as a kind of shorthand, as a dramatic moment that you need to move things along, or to give the main character this sort of catalyst to do stuff. And that's kind of been going on for a while, and I do feel like we are moving away from it now. I think people are more aware that that's a crappy trope, and I know that whenever I read it, I just stop reading, and I'm sure I'm not the only one now. I think it's fairly well known that that's fairly sort of cheesy and boring. And if nothing else, it's boring.
Yeah.
Boring. I don't need to read any more characters getting raped. And I mean, there are places where those sort of awful traumatic events are part of the story, and it can be handled well, and you can heal. You see characters healing or dealing with it, but that will always require the author to do an awful lot of work, an awful lot of thinking about it, and put in a great deal of thought into how it's handled after the incident. And most of the time, that's not what people are doing. it's kind of just thrown in as a dramatic moment. So I'm hoping we're moving away from it. I hope that modern fantasy has thought about it a bit more. I think that it will become. I know that when I come across it now, it feels very old-fashioned to see that.
Yeah.
So I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just want to say to the people who are watching, please do ask more questions. Keep your questions coming. Jen is ready to answer them. And if you don't ask questions, I'm going to keep asking my own. So, yeah, we were just talking about, how authors write stories. And in your opinion, how do you think authors can strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about things like violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Yeah, I think people often worry about coming across as preachy, or I often see reviews where, or even just opinions where people are saying, well, I'm not going to read that book because it sounds preachy and all this, or the author has an agenda. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever read a book that sounded preachy. I don't think I've ever come across that personally. I think, to be honest, the way to approach it is simply to make your characters as fully formed and as complex as possible, and to think respectfully about how stories work and how the characters interact with each other. I mean, think about what it's saying to your reader. And I don't think you need to go in with I'm going to push this message. This is my
Manifesto.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to be going there going, this is my manifesto. I'm going to beat people over the face with this and make it totally understood. I think it almost works better when you are simply asking people to have empathy for characters and experience the story through their eyes, and hopefully that makes a change in itself. So creating well-rounded characters and saying these characters are people too. I think that's kind of the main thrust of how I would do that.
All right. Now, your stories definitely pass the Bechdel test with their depiction of complex and interesting relationships between women. Why do you think many science fiction fantasy authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are so many more things that women talk about other than men? And do you have any suggestions for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
Well, somebody asked this question sort of asked this question of me a little while ago and said, how do I, basically, I'm a man, how do I write women realistically? And it was just kind of, it threw me completely, because I don't feel like it's a question that women ever ask themselves. Like, women never say, gosh, how do I write men realistically? They're so mysterious and impossible to understand. How could I ever, how can I ever peel back the mystery that is man? I don't think any women ever ask themselves that. And I know that's partly because we grow up continually shown narratives where men are the lead, and so you're continually asked to empathize with men and to understand their journey. So we all kind of grow up really familiar with it, whereas of course perhaps men don't grow up with stuff like that, so they are perhaps on a back foot in a way. But also, it's just not that complicated, you just need to write women as people. So I think there was one character in the Copper Cat trilogy quite early on. I think it was in the Copper Promise, actually, and I originally wrote her as a man, and she's only a minor character, wasn't in it a huge amount, but something about it didn't quite work for me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And in the end, I just gender swapped her. So I gender swapped him, rather. So I swapped all the pronouns to sort of she and her. It didn't really change the character otherwise, and it completely worked. And in fact, there wasn't anything else I had to change. It was just a character who was now female rather than male, and it still worked because they're just people. They're all just people. You don't have to do any special research, really, I don't think, because if you're going to write a well-rounded male character, you are also capable of writing a well-rounded female character, because they're kind of the same,
Yeah.
Like,
isn't it weird how people kind of forget that women are people too? It's so strange. It's like they're this mysterious force. They're mysterious alien creatures that we can never understand. But no, we're not. We're just people.
I know, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, yes, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I was at a discussion with a male author once who was talking about his first book, and he kind of said, "Oh well, nobody told me that I should put female characters in it, so I didn't."
Oh.
And I was like, why doesn't it occur? Like, it just seemed really peculiar to me that you could, imagine this whole world and this whole cast of characters, and never occur to you that they were all dudes, and that was a bit weird. We are like 51% of the, well, we're a good chunk of the population, so we're kind of difficult to miss. But that was seen as a completely reasonable, mistake to make.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of not recognizing women or understanding that women need to have a space as well, let's talk about geek culture. Geek culture in general, which includes science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, despite there actually being a rising number of prominent, well-respected, well-known female authors, and actually well-known and well-respected authors from a long time ago. And there's still plenty of hostile and misogynistic and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. And I think, I believe I read somewhere that you mentioned in an article on your website, maybe, that there are so many great female science fiction fantasy writers that do not get a display space on the bookshop or review space. And you talk about breaking the cycle. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? Because we have kind of always been here. There have always been great writers of science fiction and fantasy who are women, and the fandoms tend to have loads of women in. If you go to, so I've been to MCM Comic Con in London a couple of times, and if you go there, it's at least half female. A lot of there's loads of young teenage girls there who are huge fans of something or other. And if you go to conventions, there's always loads of women there. I never feel like I'm in a male space when I go to these things. And yet the perception is that it is a male space. We still talk about fantasy and science fiction as if they sort of belong to men first.
Mm-hmm.
And I still find that really confusing because, things like Star Trek, for example, the fandom for Star Trek is hugely kind of underpinned by women. It's women kind of keeping it alive when it wasn't on television and stuff like that. But we pretend that it's not, whether there's this perception that it's still very male dominated. And to be honest, I don't have an answer as to why that is. It's frustrating because you, as a female fantasy author, you often feel like you're treated like you don't exist, So whenever there is kind of like the sort of top 50 fantasy books of all time or science fiction books or whatever, you kind of look at those lists and think, well, where are all the women that are writing books on this? And it is like we fall under, we've kind of disappear through the cracks a little bit when it comes to these things. And I'm not sure how that happens, but I think probably the thing on my website was from a while ago where I was talking about, how we're represented in bookshops. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the cycle is that people look at things like those lists and things like the bookshop displays, tables and such, and only see male authors, and they think that's all that exists. So that's all that gets bought. So that's all that gets published. So there is this kind of cycle that perpetuates itself. So people look at the biggest selling fantasy authors, and they are people like George R.R. Martin or Joe Abercrombie and so on. And there is some kind of leap of logic where you think, well, those are the only people writing are dudes. So dudes must be the only people writing fantasy. They must be the only people good at it, and this kind of weird sexist idea is grown out of that. So as I've said before, the way to do that is to break it, is to break down that cycle and stop it and say, look, here is your top 10 fantasy writer dudes. Here is a top 10 of women writing fantasy, and maybe we could also look at this, or booksellers. I'm a bookseller as well, a part-time bookseller, and I do try to make sure that our science fiction and fantasy sections have, a good representation of women and people of color in the display, because if nothing else, it just makes it more interesting. I mean, you don't need another shelf full of Philip K. Dick. I mean, we all know that he existed and he wrote great books, okay, or Tolkien, we know. But maybe it's time to embrace the future of fantasy, which is extremely diverse, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we've actually been talking for about an hour. Believe it or not. So, guys, since I don't see any more questions from the audience, I'm going to ask you my final question, Jen. It's kind of a two-part question, and it's also kind of a bit of an obvious question, but we ask all our authors this. So here it goes. You've been incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Could you tell us, why do you support the cause to end violence against women, and what do you think authors such as yourself can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Yeah, as you say, it shouldn't even be something that needs to be said. Of course, nobody should live in fear of violence. Nobody should live with violence at all. And unfortunately, it's still a really huge problem. And it's incredibly sad to still be saying that in 2019, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I mean, I think it's extremely important that people can do, whatever you can do. If it helps in any small way, is incredibly important. And I suppose writers in particular, it's always our job to make people feel empathy and to introduce people to new ways of thinking. It's almost the most important job that a writer has, really. It's kind of literally the bones of it is making you experience someone else's life. And, in all the small ways that you can make somebody feel that either their behaviour is wrong, if the way that they what they're experiencing is wrong, that they can get help and change their lives, then that's a huge thing to be able to do.
Okay. Now I'm gonna wrap up stuff. We actually did have a very last question come in, but I'm so sorry to Bex Ox. We just don't have time for your question. Oh. I'm so sorry.
If they want to shout at me on Twitter, I'll answer it.
Yeah, maybe shout out to Jen on Twitter. Then she can answer your question. Oh wait, okay. I'm being told by the producer that we actually do have a little bit of time left, so I can ask your question. Okay, so here goes. Bexox, what's your first memory of reading fantasy, and what's your favorite Dragon Age moment of all time?
Oh wow. Well, gosh, my first memories of reading fantasy probably. I mean, it's always like a massive cliche, but it's probably Lord of the Rings is my first proper. It was the first time that I really fell in love with fantasy, and I got it out of the library when I was about 10. It's literally because it was the biggest book on the shelf, and I thought it made me look really impressive, and I absolutely loved it. I fell in love with it completely and read it over and over again.
That's awesome.
As my favorite moment in Dragon Age ever. God, actually, I mean, I love all of those games. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm alarmingly obsessed with them. But the first one, there's a bit very early on actually where called the Battle of Ostagar. I'm a massive nerd, by the way, about these things. There's a great bit where it kind of all kicks off, and you realise that you've been betrayed. Everything's gone wrong, and this character that you got really fond of has died, and suddenly you're kind of thrown out into this world where you have to deal with this suddenly epic story that's exploded everywhere. And it was just like the most cinematic moment that completely blew my mind, because up until that point I hadn't played any kind of next gen RPG at all. So it was like, this is like a whole new world of video games for me, and that's probably the moment that I became really embarrassingly obsessed with Dragon Age.
Okay, cool. We've learned a lot about you. Okay, so thank you everybody for your questions, and thank you, Jen, for giving us such great answers and sharing your perspective with us. I'm going to switch the screen back to me now. Hi, everyone. So I promised to tell you more about the awesome goodies we're giving away and how you can get your hands on them. So as mentioned earlier, Jen very generously donated some awesome, amazing goodies. The first bundle was the Jen Williams Dragonaut Goodie Bundle, which included the first edition paperback signed and personalized copy of The Ninth Reign and a signed and personalized first edition US paperback copy of The Copper Promise, and both the books contain much prized dragon drawings and doodles from Jen, and also there's postcards going into the bundle. Unfortunately, this bundle is not available anymore because one amazing donor has picked it up. Her name is Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. There is one more Jen Williams goodie bundle treat available, and this is a chance to become a minor character in Jen's next book, and this is also available for donors worldwide. So you will be featured in Jen's next book as a minor character, and when it is published, Jen will send you a copy wherever you are in the world. So again, this one is available to anyone in the whole wide world. So please do hurry up and get it. This is a very rare treat, this minor character perk, something very rarely offered. Okay, so here is, besides Jen's stuff, we also have other author goodies available. So let me read you a list. I have it here. I swear I do. Okay. The authors, more goodies available from authors including Tananarive Dew, Elma Alexander, Caroline Kepnes, Liana Renee Heiber, and so many more. And we'll actually be releasing new goodies every week throughout March as the campaign gets underway. Okay, I'm going to share a slide with you, which will show you where to go. There we are. So all you have to do to donate is go to our Rally App page. The link is there. bit.ly/r4p IWD 2019. And our chat box moderator is going to be pasting the link in the chat box as well, so you can just click there and go. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixel sessions that are coming up, go to our website again, bit.ly/read for pixels. And that link is also going to be posted in the chat box. Meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Celebrity Mayoral Model Pixel Reveal campaign, more about violence against women, what you can do to help end it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Please go and get your information and give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. Right, so we're almost done. I think the last thing is to ask Jen. I think you have some announcements to make.
Oh yeah, well, I was just going to say that the Poison Song comes out on May the 16th, and we are in fact launching it on the day it comes out. So we are going to be at Forbidden Planet in London on Shaftesbury Avenue from 6 o'clock, and I'll be signing books, drawing dragons in books, or anything else that you want me to draw in your book. I will draw it. I've drawn some very strange things in people's books, basically.
Like what?
Oh, I'm not sure I can even tell you. I've drawn cats, cat dragons, characters from Adventure Time, weirdly, and some rude things as well, which I will not go into.
Of course. Okay, I'm not surprised. Okay.
So, we're going to the pub after that, so if anybody wants to come along, it would be awesome to see people.
Yeah, you can have lots of mead.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, well, I just want to last thank you to all the viewers, and thank you so much, Jen, for being with us and supporting the cause for violence against women. I just want to say thank you and good night or good afternoon or good morning wherever you are in the world.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.